3 years earlier in Detroit, Detective Marty Kingston had been deeply undercover when he became involved in a narcotics deal that turned disastrous. During the resulting gunfight, he was shot in the leg. Now, as Marty entertains several school children, including his son, dressed as the police mascot, his partner, S. Quintana, is tracked to a club only to be targeted by a hooded assassin. Following a chase through the streets that ends in a crash, S is ultimately taken down at his funeral the following week. Marty assures Sergeant Clark from Internal Affairs that he will do everything in his power to apprehend his partner's killer. Later, after conversing with fellow detectives Tyrone Fowler and Jimmy Rogan, the group decides to remain vigilant in light of impending danger. Since Marty was Sal's partner for 8 years in the narcotics division, Lieutenant Walker assigns him Sal's case the next day, alongside an initially hesitant Detective Dan Sullivan. Their investigation leads them to a bar frequently visited by S, where they uncover his shady dealings. When informed about S extorting money from the bar and another club, Dan and Marty head there to speak with its owner, getting mistaken for taking over Sal's extortion activities. The owner tells them about another individual who used to accompany S. When asked to describe the man, all he says is that he is a large, intimidating fellow with a scar over his eye. On another day, Marty unexpectedly shows up at Dan's home with his wife Beth and their son Casey. Having overheard earlier that Dan and his wife Lila would soon be parents, Marty thinks of giving them the crib that Casey has outgrown. Pleasantly surprised by the thoughtful gesture, Lila invites them over for dinner. Conversation flows freely among the group, except for one topic regarding Marty and Beth's stay in Mexico. Later, Marty seizes the opportunity to speak to Dan privately. While sharing a drink, Marty learns that Dan was only 9 years old when he lost his father, who was also a police officer. Motivated to become a cop due to this loss, Dan strives to solve every case assigned to him so that another widow and young child do not face the same fate as his mother and him of remaining in the dark about their grief. Investigating alone the next day, Dan discovers a stash of cash in S's apartment when the landlord barges in. Just then, Dan is informed that S's partner, a large black and intimidating man, had given her a check last month for rent, which was not honored. Seeing the check, Dan realizes that Sal's partner is indeed Tyrone Fowler and finds that his police records are classified. Intrigued, he proceeds to meet Tyrone and Jimmy. However, Tyrone appears to deliberately provide vague responses and vehemently denies ever going to the club with S. Insulted by a rookie like Dan, questioning his reputation, Tyrone ominously warns him to keep his distance.
Sergeant Clark from Internal Affairs finds Dan later and informs him that he has been investigating S for a couple of months already. He also mentions that he recently discovered a lead on Tyrone and Jimmy, agreeing to collaborate with each other on any information they find. After this, Dan takes his leave. Meanwhile, Tyrone threatens Marty to get Dan off his case. Marty then tries to persuade Dan to investigate in a different direction and to keep Tyrone out of it, but to no avail. Supported by his conversation with Sergeant Clark, Dan informs Marty about S, Tyrone, and Jimmy being under investigation by Internal Affairs. He also mentions that Clark will meet Tyrone and Jimmy the following day. Later that evening, the assassin tracks Tyrone to a massage center and shoots him as he attempts to flee at the docks. The assassin then approaches Jimmy's yacht in a bid to end his life as well. However, Jimmy's readiness allows him to counterattack initially before being strangled with a rope. The struggle reveals Marty as the assassin, and just as he pushes the anchor off, Jimmy meets his demise. Investigating the crime scene the next morning, Dan obtains the security footage, preparing to take Marty down should the truth come to light. Marty is immensely relieved to discover that the poor quality of the recording has ensured that his face is not clearly visible. Deducing that Jimmy intended to escape before facing Clark's investigation, Dan correctly concludes that something more sinister is at play since 3 cops have lost their lives in rapid succession, all prior to their meeting with Internal Affairs. Pretending to take the footage to the forensics lab, Marty then disposes of it before heading to an abandoned barn where he has been holding a dealer named Bones captive for the past 3 days. After knocking him out, Marty collects his DNA to frame him for all the cop killings before placing him in the trunk of his car and driving away. Elsewhere, Dan visits Jimmy's wife, Sonia Rogan, who is initially reluctant to let him in. Only after confirming that he is indeed the detective assigned to the case does she invite him into her home. She tells him that since Jimmy worked in the narcotics department, he had many enemies, but nothing unusual had occurred recently. Realizing that she is certainly withholding information, Dan urges her to disclose everything she knows. However, fearing for her safety, she refuses to say anything further. Meanwhile, Marty does not expect Bones to regain consciousness and escape. Instead, he later meets Dan over drinks and advises him not to worry about Sonia keeping secrets from them, as it is quite clear that she is uncertain of the police, given that her husband has died alongside his cop partner, and Internal Affairs has been investigating them as well. Agreeing with Marty's perspective, Dan then inquires if the forensics lab was able to assist with the quality of the docs footage. Marty simply lies, stating that there was nothing they could do, suggesting the possibility of the culprit being a cop himself. Dan is rebuffed by Marty just as he receives an urgent call from the forensics department. Promptly heading over, they discover evidence linking Trayvon Bones Richardson to the crime scene. A SWAT team, accompanied by Marty and Dan, then descends upon Bones' hideout. While the team and Dan meticulously search the premises, Marty discreetly plants evidence with Bones' fingerprints. When Bones is spotted trying to escape, Dan chases him through the streets. Eventually arriving at the station, Bones boards a train and takes a passenger hostage. Urging Bones to release the hostage, Dan references the 3 cop killings he is already responsible for. Denying his involvement in the crimes, Bones insists that he was abducted and held in a place that smelled of garlic. Enraged at being blamed for actions he had no part in, Bones attacks Dan, who promptly shoots him. With the case deemed solved, Dan meets Sonia one day when she collects Jimmy's belongings from work. While she expresses her gratitude for his efforts, Marty joins the conversation, which causes her to withdraw, and she leaves. At a family dinner later that evening, Dan inquires whether Marty has an issue with Sonia based on her earlier cold demeanor. Hesitant to speak at first, Marty ultimately reveals that he competed with Jimmy for a promotion in the past. He states that since he received the promotion, things have become somewhat strained between him and Jimmy. While talking to Casey later, Dan coincidentally learns about him no longer skating in a place that reeks of garlic. Reminded of Bones mentioning being held in a similarly foul-smelling location, Dan seeks another meeting with Sonia the following day. More willing to talk to him this time, she quickly clarifies that the promotion is not the reason for her dislike of Marty. Instead, she mentions that his demeanor changed after the White Alliance was dismantled. She explains that an undercover cop group, consisting of Marty, Jimmy, and Tyrone, was tasked with taking down the biker gang that dealt in the city. She recalls Jimmy mentioning that since that undercover assignment, Marty has exhibited an attitude to differentiate himself from the others. While she presumed that Bones was working for the Alliance, Dan realizes that the case is far from over, as the killer is specifically targeting the cops who took down the Alliance.
Meeting the gang's leader in prison, Dan discovers that the gang lost $2 million to Marty and his group of undercover cops. Armed with this knowledge, Dan approaches Sergeant Clark only to learn that he has already closed the case against S, Tyrone, and Jimmy. Examining the file, he quickly realizes that the case was never about the White Alliance bust, as the sergeant also seems unaware of it. Confirming that Marty did not have access to the file, Dan resolves to investigate Marty further. Working late that night, he uncovers a lawsuit against an insurance company and recalls their conversation during the first family gathering. Promptly contacting the hospital in Oaxaca, Mexico, he impersonates Marty to obtain a copy of the receipt for Beth's treatment there. After confirming Beth's date of birth, he is informed that there is no outstanding balance on the bill. He also discovers that the last remaining amount was settled in cash, not by credit card, but in a lump sum, just as he hears that Marty paid over $212,000 in cash. Dan is startled by the arrival of an angry Marty who accuses him of ignoring his calls. Dan concocts an excuse about having to accompany Lila to the doctor while he is visibly rattled at the thought of Marty being the killer he has been pursuing. Marty assumes he is upset over Bones' demise, since it was the first time Dan took a life, assuring Dan that he acted correctly. Marty then encourages Dan to go home and get some rest. Accepting the suggestion, Dan insists he is fine before driving away. Shortly after, Marty returns and examines Dan's desk to see what he was working on. Unable to access his computer without the correct password and finding nothing in the trash, Marty opts to leave. Suddenly recalling that Dan was on the phone when he arrived, he turns back and calls the last number dialed, realizing that Dan was in contact with the hospital in Oaxaca. Marty understands that he has been caught. As Dan drives through narrow roads, he arrives at the barn that has a garlic odor. Cautiously inspecting the area, yields little until he suddenly hears a sound. Investigating carefully to see if someone followed him, he discovers it is merely an open door outside the barn, swaying in the night's breeze. Relieved, he returns to the barn and finds a stray piece of torn fabric snagged at the entrance. Determined to explore further, Dan takes the fabric to the forensic lab and is assured that it will soon be compared to Bones's jacket among the evidence of the case.
His suspicions deepen when he learns that Marty never submitted the security footage, as he claimed he would. Rushing home, he finds Marty there just as he is leaving. Marty warns Dan to abandon the case and focus on his family instead. Recognizing the threat for what it is, Dan gets Marty to admit he accepted money from a criminal. Marty tries to justify his actions by saying that he did it just once and only for Beth's cancer surgery. Distinguishing himself from the others, he insists that while he stole money a single time, corrupt cops like S, Tyrone, and Jimmy repeatedly extorted various establishments. Feeling confused, Dan speaks to Lila later that night and wonders what his next move should be, only for her to urge him to do the right thing for their safety. Meanwhile, Marty contemplates a way out of the predicament when his superior contacts him with information about meeting Sergeant Clark and Dan the following morning. In the morning, Dan receives a call from the forensics lab confirming the match of the fabric he found to Bones' jacket. He is told that since the jacket is a rare vintage item, it can reasonably be concluded that the fabric is a perfect match. Lila prepares to take Dan's car to visit the doctor. Making up his mind, Dan decides to keep this a secret just as he hears Lila leave the house. Trying to get her attention through the window, he sees her getting into his car just as it suddenly bursts into flames. Mourning the loss of his wife and unborn child, he then determinedly rushes over to confront Marty. Entering his house through the back door, Dan cautiously surveys the seemingly empty space. Convinced that the house is deserted after confirming that no one is in the upstairs bedroom, Dan begins to descend. That is when Marty ambushes him and forces him outside, holding him at gunpoint. Later that evening, Dan stops driving and threatens Beth's life if he survives Marty's rage. Realizing Dan's intention when he suddenly starts driving recklessly, Marty jumps from the vehicle just before Dan drives it off a ledge. As the car explodes, Marty searches the area for Dan while he hurriedly hides. Eventually, Dan distracts Marty to strike and overpower him. Now, at Dan's mercy, Marty profusely apologizes for causing Lila's demise, as he was the one who placed an explosive in Dan's car. Continuing to express regret even as they hear the approaching police, Marty admits that Dan is a better cop than him, and urges him not to waste his life. Just as Dan is about to relent, he takes Marty by surprise one last time before deciding to shoot him anyway. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more movie recaps.